The year was 1887, and the New Mexico Territory was running out of light. At Dry Lantern Ridge, the monthly trade market was collapsing inward, folding up like a dry leaf. The sun bled out over the western mesas, bathing the high desert in a color that was not gold, but the bruised, heavy red of old copper. Grit coated everything. It was not dust so much as the pulverized remains of the mountains, and it moved in sheets, catching in the folds of canvas wagon covers and the whiskers of tired men. The air was not quiet. It was filled with the sounds of finality, the jingle of harness, the squeal of an ungreased axle, the sharp metallic click of spurs on the packed earth of the main thoroughfare. Rowan Hale stood by his wagon, a man of 34 years who looked older in the eyes and younger in the shoulders. He was the sole proprietor of the Hollow Step Ranch, a spread tucked deep in Coppervale County that most men knew of but few had seen. Hale himself was a known quantity in Dry Lantern. He spoke little, paid in coin, and his handshake was a binding contract. He was a man built of quiet necessities, his face weathered not just by the sun, but by a solitude he seemed to prefer. He did not waste motion, and he did not waste words. And in a land where cheap talk was as common as alkali flats, this made him a figure of solid, unsettling substance. His list was short: rock salt for his cattle, a box of horseshoe nails, and maybe a sack of arbuckles if the price was right. He had the salt slung over one shoulder, the weight settling familiar and balanced, and was turning toward the blacksmith's tent. That was when the sound cut through the general noise of the closing market. It was not a gunshot. It was a voice, a man's voice, high and grating, sharpened by whiskey and impatience. It was coming from the livestock pens, where the last of the day's unwanted stock, the lame mules and the barren cows, were being sold for pennies. Rowan was not a man to poke his nose into another's business. He lived by the creed of looking away. But the sound was joined by another, a sharp smack, not of a hand on a man, but of a hand on something smaller. He turned, his boots silent in the deep dust. Near the auctioneer's block, a small crowd of 3 or 4 men had gathered. The center of it was a man Rowan recognized, Silas Sipes, a purveyor of shoddy goods and cheap whiskey, a man who always smelled of rancid bacon. Sipes was holding the bridle of a sway-backed mule hitched to a rickety milk wagon with one wheel bowed, and Sipes had his other hand clamped on the arm of a girl. She could not have been more than 20. If she was that, she was thin, in a dress made of so many different patches of calico and feed sack that its original color was a mystery. It was a garment of pure survival. But it was not her poverty that held Rowan's eye. It was her stillness, and her eyes, in a face smudged with dust. Her eyes were shockingly clear, the color of a winter sky, and they were wide with awareness. She was not looking at Sipes. She was looking past him, at the mountains, as if calculating the distance. Rowan had heard the talk, the whispers that passed through the saloons and general stores. Maris Keene, the girl from no one knew where, not deaf, they said, and not mute, because she spoke when she had to, but she was peculiar. That was the word they settled on. She was the one who, last spring, told old man Hemphill not to plant his lower field because the creek would swallow it. He had laughed. A week later, a freak storm turned that creek into a brown torrent and dragged his seed corn all the way to Texas. She was the one who listened to the wind against the telegraph wires and told the agent the lines were down near Santa Rosa. An hour before, the repair crew telegraphed the news from Santa Rosa. She did not just see the world. She seemed to be listening to it, hum. Her predictions were not magic. They were just right, and it made people profoundly uneasy. "You're part of the lot, girl." Sipes was shouting now, his face slick with sweat and frustration. "The wagon, the mule, and the help. $10. A drunk miner chuckled. "What help is she? Sipes, she's half-starved." "She's quiet," Sipes retorted, and he gave her arm a violent shake. "She'll do what she's told and won't talk back $10. Rowan watched. He saw the jerk of Sipes' hand, the way his fingers dug into her thin upper arm. He saw Maris's reaction. It was the most peculiar thing. She did not pull back. She did not fight or cry out. She moved with the pull, a sudden, fluid shift of her weight that absorbed the violence of it, turning it into nothing. She did not stumble. When Sipes let go, surprised by the lack of resistance, she simply settled back into her stillness. She never looked at Sipes. She just stared at the sliver of horizon visible between the trading post and the livery. She held her dignity like a shield. The air, which had been still, suddenly changed. A dervish of wind, born in the canyons, tore through the market street. It sounded like a scream. It hit the side of the livery stable with a bang, lifting dust and straw. High above, a loose piece of tin roofing, a patch from a long-ago storm. Ripped free, it spun in the air, a jagged silver plate, and sailed directly toward the small crowd. The other men scattered, diving away. Sipes flattened himself against the wagon wheel. Rowan did not think. It was the same instinct that made him throw himself between a new calf and a coyote. He took 2 long strides and put himself directly in front of the girl. He raised his arm, his heavy canvas coat ready to take the edge. His body braced for the impact. The tin sheet did not hit him. It caught another updraft, slammed into the wooden awning post just above his head with a deafening clang, and embedded itself there, vibrating. The wind died as quickly as it came. The street was silent. Rowan had not moved. He was still standing over her. His shadow, long and solid in the dying light, fell completely over her, blotting her out. He lowered his arm. He turned, slowly. Sipes was dusting himself off, his bravado gone, replaced by the pale, shaky look of a man who had just seen his own funeral. "How much?" Rowan Hale asked. His voice was quiet, rough like burlap. "What?" Sipes stammered. "The lot, the wagon, the mule, and the help. How much?" Sipes blinked, his greed warring with his fear. $10, that's what I said. $10, Mr. Hale." Rowan reached into his coat. He pulled out a small leather pouch, heavy with coin. He did not count. He just fished out a $10 gold piece and tossed it. The coin flashed once in the copper light before Sipes snatched it from the air. Rowan looked at the mule. He looked at the bowed wheel. He never looked at the girl. He did not know why he had done it. It was not pity. Pity was a soft, useless emotion, and he had no room for it. This felt different. It felt solid, necessary, like resetting a broken bone or putting out a fire. It was an action that the moment required. He had bought a wagon he did not need, a mule he would probably have to shoot, and a girl who listened to the sky. Sipes, clutching the coin, vanished into the nearest saloon before Hale could change his mind. The drunk miners drifted away, their entertainment over. Rowan Hale stood alone with his purchase. He walked to the mule's head and untied the rope from the hitching rail. The mule blinked at him, its ears flat. He finally looked at the girl. Maris Keene was watching him, her head slightly tilted. She did not say thank you. She did not smile, or cry, or show any relief at all. Her expression was one of pure, unsettling neutrality. Rowan gestured with his head toward his own sturdy ranch wagon, parked 50 yards down the street. "The mule follows," he said. It was not a question. Maris bent down. From beside the auction block, she retrieved a small, pathetic bundle wrapped in a frayed wool shawl. It was all she owned in the world. She straightened up, pulling the shawl around her own shoulders. Though the evening was still warm, then, without a word, she fell into step behind him, walking toward his wagon. She did not walk with him, but several paces behind, her light step making no sound in the dust. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, that line of bruised purple where the sky met the earth. She looked exactly like a person who was listening, with great concentration, for a sound that was coming from a very long way off. The ride to Hollow Step was 7 hours of silence, broken only by the steady drum of his own wagon wheels and the answering, wobbling squeak of the milk wagon he towed behind. The mule, bought for $10, was proving its worthlessness, stumbling and pulling sideways. But Rowan Hale did not spare it a glance. He drove his team with a steady hand, his eyes on the narrow track that cut through the mesas. Maris Keene had not spoken a single word since leaving Dry Lantern Ridge. She sat on the bench beside him, but she did not sit with him. She sat on the farthest edge, her small, shawled bundle clutched in her lap, her body angled slightly away from him. She did not seem afraid, which he found strange. Most women would be terrified, bought like chattel by a silent man and hauled into the wilderness. She just seemed occupied, her gaze fixed on the landscape as it passed. She watched the strata of the rocks, the behavior of the hawks, the way the wind bent the rabbit brush. They arrived well after midnight, under a sliver of moon that did little more than make the shadows deeper. Hollow Step Ranch was not a welcoming place. The ranch house was low-slung, built of thick pine logs chinked with mud, hunkered down against the wind rather than standing up to it. The corrals were sturdy, the barn functional, but there was no paint, no garden, no sign of a woman's hand. It was a place of work, not comfort. The land itself was harsh, a basin of stingy, gray-green grass that followed a seasonal creek, all of it crouched under the looming shadow of a mesa that looked, in the dark, like the spine of some colossal, sleeping animal. Rowan pulled the wagon to a halt by the main house. The sound of the brake lever was loud in the quiet. "We're here," he said. He stepped down, his joints stiff from the ride. He turned to offer her a hand, a gesture of rote politeness, but she was already moving. She did not wait for him. She slid off the bench on her own, landing as lightly as a cat, her feet making no sound in the dust. Her bundle was still in her hand. She stood for a long moment, not moving toward the house, but simply standing by the wagon wheel. She was not looking at him. Her head was tilted, and her eyes, which seemed to capture the scant moonlight, were moving. She was not taking in the view, she was taking inventory. Her gaze tracked from the wellhead to the stable door, from the stable door to the two low windows of the main house, from the windows to the porch steps. She was memorizing the layout, the exits, the angles. Rowan felt a disquiet he could not name. He had brought home something he did not understand. "The house," he said, gesturing with his chin. He led the way up the 3 plank steps onto the porch. He pushed the door open, it scraped the floorboards and entered the darkness. He struck a match, the sulphurous flare momentarily blinding him, and lit the coal oil lamp on the main table. The room was as he had left it, functional, bare. A table, 2 chairs, a cold fireplace, and the smell of old leather, wood smoke, coffee, and solitude. "You'll sleep here." He gestured not to a bedroom, but to the door of the small storeroom off the kitchen. It was where he kept his winter supplies, feed sacks, and broken tack. It was windowless, but it was dry. He went in first, lit a second lamp, and set it on a crate. He kicked aside a pile of empty burlap sacks to clear a space on the floor. He turned, went to his own cot in the main room, and pulled off one of his 2 thick wool blankets. He brought it back and dropped it on the cleared space. From a kitchen shelf, he took a dented tin cup and a matching plate. He set them on the crate beside the lamp. "It's all I have," he said. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. Maris looked at the room. She looked at the blanket, the cup, the lamp. Then she looked at him, her gaze as clear and unreadable as water. She gave a single, small nod. She set her bundle down on the blanket. She had accepted. Rowan stood there for a moment, feeling awkward and oversized. He had handled stampedes, blizzards, and standoffs, but he had no idea what to say next. "Good night," he finally managed, and pulled the door mostly shut, leaving it cracked an inch for air. He sat on his own cot, pulling off his boots. He heard no sound from the storeroom, no crying, no movement, just silence. He lay back, his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling beams. He had just added a mouth to feed, a complication he did not need. He fell into a restless sleep, the image of her fluid, non-violent avoidance of Sipe's hand playing over and over in his mind. Hours later, he woke. The wind was up. This was not the brief, angry gust from the market. This was the true voice of the high desert. A low, keening moan that pressed against the house like a living thing. It was a sound that made men feel small, He heard the soft click of the storeroom latch. Rowan was instantly still. He listened. He heard the scrape of the main door again, lighter this time. He got up from the cot, his stockinged feet silent on the wood floor. He moved to the front window and looked out onto the porch. She was there. The wind was whipping her thin dress around her legs and tearing at her hair, but she did not seem to notice. She was not cowering from it. She was kneeling, her back to him. She had placed one hand, palm down, flat against the wooden planks of the porch, as if feeling its vibration. After a moment, she moved off the porch and knelt in the yard, placing her bare hand flat against the cold, hard-packed earth. She held it there for a long time, her head bowed, motionless. Rowan watched, a strange coldness running up his spine, stones cracking to the west. She whispered. He heard it clearly through the cracked window. The wind nearly stole the words, but he heard them. It was not said to him, or to God, or to anyone. It was a simple observation, stated to the night. He listened. He heard only the wind. When he woke again, it was to a different sensation. Not a sound, but a smell, or rather, the lack of one. Every morning for 3 years. Rowan had woken to the smell of his own failure, the acrid, choking pall of smoke from the kitchen fireplace. The flue was badly designed, the draw poor. No matter how he set the kindling, the house filled with smoke before the fire caught. This morning, the air was clear and warm. He got up and walked into the kitchen. Maris was there, her back to him, poking the fire. A clean, bright fire of juniper and mesquite crackled in the hearth. A pot of coffee, his pot, was nestled in the coals. The room was not only free of smoke, it smelled of coffee and baking. A small pan of biscuits, made from his own supplies, sat on the warming stone. He looked at the fireplace. She had been outside. She had found several flat pieces of shale. She had restacked the fire back and, just inside the flue opening, angled a thin, wide stone. It was a simple, brilliant adjustment of airflow. It forced the draft. It was something he had never thought to do. "You fixed the chimney," he said. She glanced over her shoulder. Her hair was pulled back, tied with a scrap of leather. "The smoke needed a throat," she said simply. She gestured to the coffee. "It's ready." He poured a cup, the hot tin warming his hands. He watched her. She moved with an economy of motion he recognized because it was his own. No wasted steps, no hesitation. Later that day, he went to the stable to tend the stock. His best horse, a nervous bay gelding named Hollow Finch, was his main frustration. The horse was fast and strong, but raw-nerved. It flinched at every sound, fought the bit, and was held to saddle. He found Maris in the round corral with the horse. She held no rope, no bridle, no sugar lump. Hollow Finch was standing in the center, blowing and sidestepping, its ears pinned. Maris just stood there, just inside the gate. She was not looking at the horse. She was looking at the ground, breathing. She let out a long, slow breath, an audible sigh. The horse's ears flickered. It stopped moving. She let out another, just as slow, just as calm. The horse's head lowered an inch. She took one step toward it, still not looking at it, and breathed out again. The horse stood still. She took another step, and another. A slow, rhythmic progression, breathing evenly. When she was finally beside it, she slowly lifted a hand. She did not pat it, which would have startled it. She simply laid her hand on its muscled shoulder and left it there, breathing. Rowan watched, stunned, as Hollow Finch, the horse that would not be still, let out its own long sigh. Its head dropped, its eyes half closed. Maris began to stroke its mane, a steady, repetitive motion, and the horse stood as if rooted to the earth, completely at her mercy. That evening, Rowan took down the large, cracked slate board he used for tracking feed sales. He wiped it clean with a damp rag and hung it from a nail on the kitchen wall. By the door, he found a nub of chalk. He wrote, "Need to reset fence posts, north pasture. Axe handle is cracked." He tapped the chalk on the board, looked at Maris, and went outside. When he came back in for supper, she had written on it. Her handwriting was small, sharp, and angular, with no wasted loops or curls. Larder low on flour. Water in rain barrel is alkali. Backstep is loose. He nodded. The chalk accord was established. It was a language they both understood. Days passed. They lived in this shared, practical silence. He would write a task. She would add a need. She mended his clothes with the same neat, economical stitches she used for her own. She cooked, cleaned, and fixed things: a harness buckle, a squeaking hinge, the chimney. She did not just do the work, she improved the function. Rowan found himself breathing easier. The ranch, which had always been a solitary battle, felt managed. One afternoon, the air went dead. The heat was oppressive, the sky a cloudless, searing blue. A thin spiral of dust kicked up in the yard, spun for a moment, and died. Maris, who was oiling a saddle, stopped. She looked up, sniffing the air, her head tilted as it had been that first night. She touched the metal cinch buckle, then rubbed her thumb and forefinger together. "What?" Rowan asked. He was sitting on the porch, carving a new axe handle. She looked toward the faint, hazy line of mountains that marked the way to Dry Lantern Ridge. "Static," she said, her voice quiet. "The air is full of it." She paused. "The telegraph will bring news by evening, a bad one." Rowan stopped carving. He looked at the sky. It was perfectly, painfully clear. There was no sign of a storm, not even the high feathery mare's tails that signaled a change. He looked back at her. This was the peculiar side of her, the side that made townsfolk uneasy. He felt a sudden, sharp impulse to discount her. It was just a hot day. But then he remembered the chimney. He remembered Hollowfinch, who now followed her around like a hound. He grunted, not committing, but he stood up, went inside to the slate board, and picked up the chalk. He felt almost foolish, but he wrote it down. It was a kind of respect. Maris says storm coming. He went back to his work. The afternoon wore on. Hot and still, no storm came. As evening approached, Rowan saddled his other horse. He needed supplies, and he wanted to hear the news. He rode into Dry Lantern Ridge as the telegraph office was closing. The agent, a young man with a green visor, was just stepping out. Locking the door, he saw Rowan and waved, his face pale. "Mr. Hale, thank God you're here. The line just came alive. It's been dead for hours. A flash storm came out of nowhere. Up north, it washed out the entire rail bridge at the Cimarron crossing." Rowan felt a jolt, as if he had touched a live wire himself. He stared at the agent. "When? They say it hit about an hour ago. Just came out of a clear sky. They said a wall of water. Terrible thing." Rowan did not go to the general store. He did not buy his flour. He slowly turned his horse, his mind racing. The telegraph will bring news by evening. He rode back to Hollow Step in the dark. The sky above him was still perfectly clear, dotted with stars, but the world felt different, less solid than it had been that morning. He dismounted and walked into the house. The lamp was lit. Maris was at the table, mending one of his shirts. She looked up when he entered. She did not ask about the supplies. She did not say a word. She just met his gaze, her own as calm as ever. Rowan walked past her, to the slate board. He stood looking at it for a long time, the chalk nub in his hand. Maris says, "Storm coming." Slowly, he raised his hand. He drew a single, thick, decisive chalk line through the first two words. It now read, "Storm coming." 2 days after Rowan had corrected the slate, the world changed. The sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned the color of a fresh bruise. A sickly yellow-green light seeped over the mesas, pressing down on the ranch. The air, usually dry and thin, became heavy, wet, and still. It felt like cotton wool in the lungs. Rowan Hale, standing on his porch, tasted metal in the air. The storm coming on the slate board had ceased to be a prediction. It was now a threat. Out in the high pasture, his new calves, usually scattered and rowdy, were acting strangely. They had gathered in a tight, nervous knot. All their tails pointed northwest. bracing against a wind that had not yet begun to blow. Even Hollow Finch, the gelding that Maris had calmed, was restless, pacing the line of his corral and snorting at the sky. Rowan did not need to be told. He was already moving, but he found Maris was ahead of him. She was not panicking. She was working with a swift, desperate efficiency that was more frightening than any scream. She was not reinforcing the main barn. She was hauling armloads of straw and cut hay into the smaller, low-roofed auxiliary shed, a lean-to he used for calving. "What are you doing?" Rowan shouted, his voice sounding flat in the dead air. "The herd's in the main barn." "Not for long," she said, not looking up. She was wedging a spare plank against the shed's flimsy door, reinforcing the latch. "Bring the salt lick and the barrel of oats. Here." He did not question her. He did it. He hauled the heavy 100-pound sack of oats and rolled the 50-pound salt lick into the small shed. She had already forked the straw into deep bedding. She was preparing a fortress. Just as he set the salt down, the first gust hit. It did not arrive gradually. It struck the ranch like a physical blow, a solid wall of moving air that shrieked like a train. The main barn, the high-peaked, older structure, let out a long, groaning keoket as the timbers twisted. "The herd," Rowan said, turning toward the sound. "Wait," Maris said. She ran from the shed, not to the barn doors, but to the north wall. It was the solidest part of the barn, built against a low rise in the earth, designed to block the prevailing winter winds. She pressed her ear and then her flat palm against the heavy logs. The wind was screaming, tearing at her hair. Rowan ran to her. "What is it? Get them out of that corner," she yelled over the din. "Move them now." "That's the safest spot," he yelled back, exasperated. "It's the windbreak, Maris. That's the lee side." She grabbed the front of his heavy canvas coat, her small hand bunched in the material. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with a terrible certainty. "It sounds thin," she screamed. "The foundation under the main post. It sounds thin. It's hollow." He did not understand the words. Hollow, but he understood her face. The memory of the telegraph office, of the clear sky that had broken a bridge, surged in him. He ran. He burst through the main barn doors, fighting the wind. The cattle were already lowing, terrified, and huddled exactly where he thought they were safest, in the dead corner, pressed against the north wall. He grabbed a pitchfork, screaming, "Hiya, get up, move!" He was a man possessed, jabbing and yelling, forcing the confused, heavy beasts away from the wall. They resisted, wanting the shelter. He fought them, shoving them. I said move!" The last calf, a stubborn brindle, finally scrambled away from the corner, joining the others in the relative exposure of the center aisle. Rowan had just taken 2 steps back when the sky tore open. It was not a crack of lightning. It was a white, blinding explosion that struck the ranch. The sound was not thunder. It was the sound of a mountain breaking. It was instantaneous. Rowan was thrown from his feet. The massive, century-old pine post that held up the entire north corner of the roof, the very spot where Maris had pressed her hand, disintegrated. It did not fall. It vaporized, turned to splinters by a direct, billion-volt strike. The lightning had found the structural flaw, she heard, with a sound like the world ending. The entire north section of the heavy roof collapsed. Rafters, tin sheets, and 1,000-pound logs crashed down, burying the precise spot where his entire herd had been huddled not 10 seconds earlier. Dust, straw, and the smell of ozone filled the air. Rowan was on his knees, staring. The cattle were bawling. Safe. He was alive. He looked at the wreckage, a tomb of wood and metal, and felt a cold deeper than the wind. He scrambled to his feet. Maris! He saw her fighting with the main doors, trying to heave the massive crossbar into place. The wind was trying to suck the doors from their hinges. He threw his weight against the wood, his shoulders slamming into hers. Together, they forced the bar home, sealing the barn just as the first wave of rain hit. It was not rain. It was a horizontal sheet of water and ice that hammered the tin roof. The sound was deafening, a continuous, maddening roar, as if they were inside a metal drum being beaten by giants. "The lean-to," he shouted, remembering the supplies. "The door won't hold." He ran to the smaller side door, the one that led to the calving shed she had prepared. The wind had already found the weakness. The door was bowing inward, the latch rattling. He shoved his shoulder against it. A new sound joined the din, a high-pitched, metallic shriek from above. He looked up. In the chaos of the post's collapse, a main crossbeam, a heavy 6x6 timber, had been jolted from its seating. It was hanging by a single remaining bolt, twisting and groaning with every vibration of the roof. It was directly above him. He did not see it. He was focused on the door, on the water pouring in around the frame, on the exposed sacks of feed. He heard Maris shout his name, but it was lost in the storm. He felt a sudden, sharp impact on his back. It was not a blow. It was a shove. Her hand, small but braced with all her weight, pressed into the center of his spine. It was not a hand of panic. It was a hand of pure, focused intention. It sent him staggering forward. Off balance, he fell, sprawling onto his hands and knees in the wet straw. A heartbeat later, the massive timber beam tore free. It crashed down onto the exact spot where he had been standing. It struck the wooden water trough, smashing it into wet kindling. Shrapnel from the trough whistled past his head. He stayed on his knees, breathing hard. The rain and wind roared. He looked at the shattered wood. He looked at the beam, thick as his own thigh, lying where his chest had been. He turned, slowly. Maris was standing 2 feet away, her hand still slightly raised. The world, for 1 second, seemed to go silent. All he could feel, burned into his memory, was the precise, calm, living warmth of her palm against his back. It was the first time she had touched him. It had saved his life. The storm raged for 4 hours and passed by dawn. They emerged into a world scoured and broken. The sky was a pale, innocent blue, the air cold and sharp. The ranch was a sea of red mud and debris. The north corner of the barn was a pile of rubble. They did not speak of what happened. There were no words for it. There was only work. They spent the entire day in a synchronized, silent partnership. He salvaged the usable tin sheets, his muscles straining as he hauled the twisted metal. She pulled the heavy, waterlogged saddles from the mud, dragging them one by one into the house to be dried by the fire. He set to work with his axe and saw, clearing the shattered timbers. She waded into the ruined feed room, separating the wet grain from the dry, saving what she could. By evening, they had a temporary patch on the roof, and the cattle, safe in the undamaged section, were fed. The saddles steamed by the fire. They sat at the kitchen table, too exhausted to eat, covered in mud and pine tar. Rowan was cleaning his tools. He watched Maris try to flex her hands. They were raw, the skin rubbed off in 6 places from hauling the wet leather and sharp tin. One blister on her right palm had torn open and was bleeding sluggishly. Rowan looked at her hand, then at his own, which were calloused like old bark. He said nothing. He stood, his joints popping, and went to his own cot. From a small wooden box, he took a clean strip of linen, torn from an old shirt, and a small tin of axle grease. It was all he had. He sat down opposite her again. He put the cloth and the tin on the table. He looked at her, then motioned with his chin. "Hand." She hesitated, then slowly extended her right hand, palm up. He took it. Her hand was lost in his. His were huge, rough, stained with dirt and work. He felt coarse and clumsy. He dipped 2 of his thick fingers into the grease, his touch unexpectedly light. He smeared the dark grease over the raw, red blister. She flinched, just once, a tiny intake of breath, but did not pull away. His brow furrowed in concentration. He laid the linen strip across her palm. Then, awkwardly, his large fingers fumbled as he tried to wrap it. He was used to branding irons and rope, not bandages. He pulled the knot too tight. "Sorry," he muttered, unfastening it. He tried again, his motions slow, deliberate, astonishingly gentle. He made a neat, secure bandage. He finished the knot and, for a second, his thumb rested on her wrist. He let go as if her skin were hot. He cleared his throat and stood up. "The roof will hold," he said, and walked outside into the cold twilight. Word of the storm at Hollowa Step traveled faster than the wind that brought it. The story was told by a neighbor who had ridden over to check on Rowan, seen the devastation, and seen the miraculously unharmed herd. But the story that reached Dry Lantern Ridge was not one of luck or preparation. It was of the girl. "The girl who hears the storm," they called her. They said she had known where the lightning would strike. They said she had told the storm where to go, sparing the cattle. In the Silver Lamp Saloon, the talk was loud. "A witch, I say," a miner declared, slamming his glass. Sheriff Wade Cullum, a practical man who trusted bullets and law books, was leaning against the bar. He heard the talk and sneered. "A lucky guess. Hale is a good rancher, and he got lucky. This girl is probably just spooked. He is a fool for keeping her." But Delia Crow, the woman who owned the Silver Lamp, saw things differently. She moved through the smoke, her smile tight. Fear and curiosity, she knew, sold more whiskey than gold strikes. "A witch, you say? How strange, how fascinating. I wonder what else she can hear." She poured the miner another drink. "The strangest things happen out in the desert, do they not?" The rumor, under her careful guidance, began to bloom, growing darker and more alluring. Rowan knew nothing of this until he brought his weekly delivery of milk and butter to the general store. The store went quiet when he walked in. Men stopped talking. They looked at him, then looked away. They glanced at him not as Rowan Hale, the quiet rancher, but as a man who was keeping a secret, a man who had something unnatural at his ranch. He felt their stares like a physical weight. He concluded his business, his face a mask of stone, and rode home, his jaw tight with a cold anger. He spent the evening in the house, cleaning his rifle, the oiled rag moving back and forth, back and forth. He was preparing to ride back in the morning, though he did not know what he would say, or to whom. Maris was watching him. She went to the slate board. He heard the faint scrape of chalk. When he looked up, she had written 2 words. "Go with Rowan stopped cleaning the gun." He looked at the words. He looked at her. She was not afraid of the town, or the rumors, or of him. She was simply standing, waiting, her bandaged hand at her side. She was ready to face what she had heard coming. He looked at her, at this small, strange woman who had fixed his chimney, calmed his horse, and saved his life. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Tomorrow," he said. It would be the first time they had ridden off the ranch not as a man and his help, but as 2 people, side by side. They rode into Dry Lantern Ridge the next morning. Rowan had not just saddled his own horse. He had prepared Hollow Finch for Maris. The horse, once a bundle of raw nerves, stood quiet as she mounted, moving with an easy grace, as if she had been riding her entire life. They rode side by side, a silent, 2-person column. The town felt different, or perhaps they were the ones who were different. As they passed the livery in the smithy, the usual sounds of work, the ring of a hammer on an anvil, the call of a teamster faltered. Men stopped what they were doing. They watched the pair. They watched the quiet rancher, Hale, and they watched the pale, strange girl riding his finest horse. The whispers that had been confined to the saloon were now in the open air, a low buzz of suspicion and fear. Rowan ignored them. He did not stop at the general store. He did not stop at the assay office. He rode directly to the Silver Lamp Saloon, dismounted, and tied both their horses to the hitching rail. Maris slid from the saddle before he could offer a hand. She stood beside him on the boardwalk, her small, worn bundle in one hand. She looked at the batwing doors, her expression as calm and neutral as the desert sky. "Stay close," Rowan said, his voice low. It was the only instruction he gave. He pushed the doors open. The saloon, even at mid-morning, was thick with smoke and the sour smell of spilled whiskey. A dozen men were present, miners, a few off-duty ranch hands, and the town's less reputable merchants. At the bar, cleaning a glass, was Delia Crow. She was a woman in her 40s. with hair the color of new brass and eyes that missed nothing. She saw them enter, and her professional smile, the one she used for paying customers, widened just a fraction. It became a smile of genuine, predatory interest. Leaning against the far wall, his badge pinned to a dusty vest, was Sheriff Wade Cullum. He saw Rowan and Maris, and his posture did not change. He merely watched, his eyes lazy, taking in the scene with a detached curiosity. He did not intervene. He was waiting to see what would happen, and in the corner, at a table, sat a man in a stark black coat. Abram Pike, the town's preacher, was a man whose faith was built on a foundation of brimstone. He looked at Maris as if she were a snake that had just slithered into his church, his face tightening with a righteous disgust. Rowan Hale walked to the bar, his boots heavy on the boards. Maris was a half-step behind him, her presence a silent echo. "Delia," Rowan said, his voice quiet, but it cut through the room's low murmur. "I have your week's butter." He set a cloth-wrapped brick on the bar. Before Delia could answer, a voice slurred from a nearby table. "Well, look who's here. It's the Rainmaker and his pet witch." 3 miners, their faces red from drink and sun, shoved their chairs back. Their leader, a big man with a tangle of beard, lurched toward Maris. "Hey now, girlie," he sneered, his breath a wave of alcohol. "Forget the butter. Tell us where the color is. You can hear the rocks. Can't you tell old Jeb where to dig his fortune?" "Leave her be," Rowan said. He did not raise his voice. He did not turn. "Or maybe," another miner chimed in, laughing, "you can tell me if my wife back in Missouri is being true. Give us a sign." "Which?" The big miner. Jeb was emboldened by the sheriff's silence. He reached out a grimy hand, aiming to grab Maris's arm, just as Sipes had done. "Come on, be sweet, just a little fortune." Rowan moved. He did not draw his gun. He simply shifted his weight, stepping between the miner and Maris, his body a solid wall. His hand shot out and clamped down on the miner's wrist. He did not grab it, he seized it. Jeb cried out, his knees buckling as Rowan's grip closed like a steel trap. The saloon went quiet. "I said," Rowan repeated, his eyes cold as a winter well. "Leave her be. Now." "Hale," Sheriff Cullum said, his voice lazy, unconcerned. "No need for rough stuff. The boys are just curious. We all are. We hear things." Rowan held the miner's wrist for one more second, then shoved it back. Jeb stumbled away, cradling his hand, his drunken courage gone. "She is not a sideshow," Rowan stated to the room. "Then what is she?" Reverend Pike's voice sliced through the tension. He stood up, his black coat making him look like a crow. "What is this power she brought to your ranch? The Lord protects his flock with faith. Mr. Hale, not with divinations. This is the devil's work." A murmur of agreement ran through the room. Fear was a stronger currency than gold, and Pike was mining it. "She is not a devil," Rowan said, his frustration growing. He was a man of action, and this web of words was choking him. "Then prove it," Delia Crow said, her voice smooth. She had stopped cleaning the glass. She was smiling. Show us. She's just a normal girl." All eyes turned to Maris. She was the center of a storm of fear, greed, and accusation. She had not flinched. She had not hidden behind Rowan. She stood, her gaze distant, but she was not looking at the miners, or the sheriff, or the preacher. She was looking at the floor. Specifically, she was looking at the corner where the miners had been sitting, a section of the floor dark with spilled drinks and boot scuffs. She took one step away from Rowan, toward the bar. She placed her unbandaged hand, palm down, on the thick mahogany plank of the bar top. She closed her eyes for just a second. She was listening. "That floor," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the dead silence. It was the first time any of them had heard her speak. "It is hollow. The joist underneath is rotten from the damp. Do not dance on it." The miners looked down at their feet, confused. Jeb, the one Rowan had grabbed, let out a nervous, angry laugh. "Hollow, what is this? A trick? It's solid as a rock." To prove his point, he stomped his heavy boot. Thud. "See nothing." He stomped again, harder, a defiant, drunken jig. Thud. Crack. The sound was not loud. It was a sickening, splintering noise. The section of flooring where the 3 miners had been standing, an area perhaps 5 feet square, suddenly gave way. With a single whoosh of rotten wood and stale air, the planks collapsed, dropping Jeb and his 2 companions into the shallow, cobweb-choked crawl space beneath the saloon. It was not a deep fall, no more than 3 or 4 feet, but it was absolute. One moment they were there, and the next, there was just a ragged, dark hole. A cloud of dust and dried mold rose from the hole. The saloon was utterly, profoundly silent. Every man, including the sheriff, stared at the new opening in the floor. From the darkness, a cough, then a string of curses. "My leg! I think my leg's broke! Get us out!" Maris had not moved. She simply looked at the hole, her face impossible to read. Reverend Pike was the first to find his voice. His face was white, his eyes wide. He pointed a trembling finger at Maris. "Sorcery you saw," she called it. "She brought ruin upon this house." "She warned him," Rowan said, his voice a low growl. "She told him not to dance." "It's a dark power," Pike insisted, his voice rising to a pulpit shout. "She speaks to the earth and it obeys. This is a blight on our town. She must be cast out." A few men nodded, their fear of the preacher overcoming their common sense. "He's right," someone whispered. "This ain't natural." Delia Crow, however, was already looking at the hole with a calculating expression. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was adding up the cost of repairs against the value of a story like this. Her saloon was now legendary. She hid her smile behind her hand. Sheriff Cullum finally pushed himself off the wall. He sighed, annoyed at the paperwork. "Well, Hale, you've made your point, and your friend has made hers, and a hole in Delia's floor. Now get these fools out," he said to the barman. Rowan Hale looked at the faces around him, the fear, the suspicion. He looked at Pike's righteous hatred and Cullum's lazy indifference. He put his body between them and Maris. He did not need to shout. His presence, his quiet solidity, was enough. "She saved my herd," he said to the entire room. "When that storm came, she saved every animal I own. She did what none of you could do. She did what none of you even knew needed doing." He paused, letting the silence stretch. No one met his eye. He picked up the brick of butter. "Delia, I'll take this to the general store. They'll pay you for it. We are done here." He turned. Maris was already at the door. He followed her out, the bat-wing doors swinging shut behind them, leaving the silver lamp to its hole, its rumors, and its preacher. They rode in silence, leaving the cluster of buildings that was Dry Lantern Ridge behind. The sun was hot on their backs. The desert was wide and quiet, a relief after the close, sour air of the saloon. They rode for a mile, the only sound the steady hoofbeats of the 2 horses. Finally, Maris spoke. She did not look at him, but at the purple line of the distant mountains. "You have regret?" she asked. Rowan thought for a long time. He thought of the looks on their faces. He thought of the hole in the floor and the barn that was still standing. He thought of the calm, steady warmth of her hand on his back. "No," he said. "I do not, but we will need believers." He pulled his horse to the left, off the main track to Hollow Step. One stop to make. He led them to a small dugout, little more than a burrow in the side of a hill, 3 miles from his own ranch. A thin plume of smoke rose from a tin chimney. This was the home of the widow Eulaine, a woman left with nothing but 2 children and a plot of barren land. As they approached, they heard it. A dry, rasping cough. A child's cough, but it sounded like a saw cutting through dry wood. Rowan dismounted, pulling a small sack of flour from his saddlebag. Maris was off her horse before him, her bundle in her hand. She followed him to the door. Inside, the single room was dark and close. Mrs. Eulaine, her face a mask of sleepless panic, was trying to spoon water into a small boy who thrashed, his face a pale, bluish gray. He was fighting for every breath, and the horrible barking cough shook his whole body. "Mr. Hale," the widow whispered, her voice cracking. "He's been like this all night. The fever won't break. He can't breathe." Maris moved past Rowan. She did not hesitate. She knelt by the boy, who was perhaps 4 years old. She laid her cool hand on his forehead, then on his heaving chest. She listened, her head tilted, just as she had in the barn. "The air is trapped," she said. She looked at Rowan. "Boil water, all of it." She turned to Mrs. "Elaine, do you have wild cherry bark?" I think so. For winter. Get it, and blankets." While Rowan built up the fire and put the kettle on, Maris went to work. She was no longer the strange, silent girl from the saloon. She was a general. She had Mrs. Elaine hang blankets over the door and the one small window. "To hold the steam." She boiled the dark, astringent bark into a harsh tea. When the kettle was roaring, she had Mrs. Elaine hold the boy, his head over the plume of steam. She took the pillow sack stuffed with dry grass and arranged them so the boy was sitting up, his airway straight. She opened the door just a crack, letting in a single thin line of cold, fresh air, routing it so it did not hit the child but moved the steam. She sat with the boy, forcing a few drops of the bitter tea between his lips. She rubbed his chest with a steady, circular motion. She listened. They stayed for an hour. The room became a small, warm cloud. Slowly, miraculously, the terrible, sawing sound softened. The child's cough became wet, productive. He took a shuddering, deep breath, then another. The blue tinge left his lips. He fell into a deep, exhausted, true sleep. Mrs. Elaine was weeping silently, her hands pressed to her mouth. Rowan and Maris left, stepping out into the cold, clear afternoon. The next morning, as Rowan was resetting the gate on the corral, he saw a figure walking the long track to the ranch. It was Mrs. Elaine. She must have walked for an hour. She was carrying something wrapped in a clean dishcloth. She walked up to Maris, who was mending a bridle. She did not say thank you. She held out her offering. It was a loaf of bread, fresh from her oven, still warm. A steam of yeast and honey rose from it. "God bless you," the widow said, pressing the bread into Maris's hands. Maris took the bread. She looked at Mrs. Elaine, and for the first time since he had known her, Rowan Hale saw the corners of her mouth lift in a small, almost imperceptible smile. They had their first believer. The peace lasted 2 days. Then, Sheriff Cullum rode out to Hollow Step. He was alone, and he was not smiling. He found Rowan splitting logs. "Hale, Sheriff." Rowan did not stop his axe. "Thunk. I've got news. Rustlers. Hit the Bar T and the Circle K last night. Drove off maybe 30 head. It's Jack Stolder's crew. I know their sign." "Bad news," Rowan said. "Thunk." Cullum spat a stream of tobacco juice. "It is. Now. My trackers are good, but Tolder is smart. He'll cut through the canyons, and they'll lose him. It's a waste of time." He paused, looking over at the ranch house, where Maris was hanging laundry. "I was thinking, Hale, that business in the saloon, the floor, and your barn. It seems your girl has a talent for finding things." Rowan stopped, the axe held in his hand. "I was thinking," the sheriff continued, "maybe she could, listen, tell me which canyon Tolder took, save the county a lot of time and money." Rowan slowly lowered the axe. He looked at the sheriff, his face flat and unreadable. "First," he said, his voice quiet, "her name is Maris. Second, she is not a water witch. Sheriff, she's not a bloodhound." Cullum's eyes narrowed. "I am not asking. I'm employing a county asset." "She is not a county asset," Rowan said. "She has work to do here, at my ranch." The two men stared at each other for a long, cold moment. The sheriff was the law, but Rowan was on his own land. Cullum knew he could not force it. "You're making a mistake, Hale," Cullum said, turning his horse. "You're shielding something the town don't understand. That's a dangerous thing to do." "Good day, Sheriff," Rowan said. Cullum spurred his horse and rode off, a cloud of angry dust rising behind him. Rowan watched him go, knowing he had just drawn another line, this one against the law itself. He had protected her, but he had also made them both targets. Rowan Hale watched Sheriff Cullum ride away, the anger from the man's dust hanging in the air long after he was gone. He looked at the axe in his hand, then at Maris, who was quietly gathering the laundry she had dropped. He had drawn a line against the town, and now against the law. He was an island, and she was on it with him. "He is not wrong," Rowan said, his voice flat. "Tolder is a threat." Maris paused, a white linen shirt in her hands. "He is looking in the wrong place. He is using his eyes, and I will use the ground." She finished folding the shirt. "They are your neighbors. The cattle should come home." He had not asked her to help. He had not needed to. She had known the question before he formed it. They did not ride out immediately. Rowan was a man of preparation. He spent the rest of the day cleaning his rifle, packing jerky, grain, and water. He was not a lawman, but he was a rancher, and he knew the canyons. He also knew Tolder's reputation, a man who was fast, brutal, and favored the complex, rocky mazes of the high country where a posse would splinter and get lost. They left before dawn the next day, not as a posse, but as a two-person whisper. Rowan led his own mount, a steady pack mule, and a hollow finch. Maris walked. He had questioned this. "It is a long ride to the notch. I cannot hear the earth from a saddle." She'd said it was final. He did not argue. He simply slowed his pace to match hers. They found the tracks easily, leaving the Bar T Ranch and heading straight for the canyons. The sign was crude, desperate. 30 head of cattle, pushed hard. Rowan knelt by a hoof print. "The brands are cut," he said, touching the mark in the dust. Tolder's men had used a hot iron to crudely alter the Bar T and Circle K brands into a meaningless, bloody smear. It was a wound, not a mark. They entered the mouth of Hollow Notch as the sun climbed, painting the high sandstone walls in shades of blood and rust. The canyon was a labyrinth, a series of forks and false passages. Rowan was a good tracker, but here the rock bottom left few tracks. He was forced to rely on overturned stones, a broken piece of scrub. Maris, however, seemed to grow more confident. She walked with one hand trailing along the canyon wall. She was not feeling the texture, she was feeling the vibration. Her head was tilted, her entire body an instrument of reception. "They are slowing," she said, her voice barely a breath. "The animals are tired. They are pushing them too hard." Rowan looked at the ground. He could see nothing. "How do you know?" "The echoes are wrong. The hoofbeats are heavy, dragging. They are not lifting their feet." They walked for another hour, the silence of the canyon pressing in. The air was still. They came to a major fork. The tracks, faint but visible, veered clearly to the right, into a wider, more accessible box canyon. Rowan motioned. "This way." Maris put her hand on his chest, stopping him. "No." Rowan froze. She pointed to the left fork, a narrow, winding goat path that seemed to climb into the rock. "They are not that way." She pointed to the right fork, the one with the tracks. "They are there." Rowan felt the cold chill he'd felt in the barn. "Maris, the tracks go right. That is the way. The tracks are a lie," she whispered. She stepped back from the wall and tilted her head, her eyes closing. She was listening to the dead air. "It is an ambush. They are waiting for the sheriff. You cannot know that." "I can," she said, her voice sharp with certainty. Listen." Rowan listened. He heard nothing. A hawk's cry, high above, the wind. "I hear nothing." "Exactly. There are 30 head of cattle in that canyon, and 3 men. There should be a sound, a cow lowing, a man coughing, a harness jingle. There is nothing. They are being quiet. They are waiting." She put her hand back on the wall. "And one man is nervous. His horse is shifting. A bridle ring just tapped a rock. I heard it. Not from the canyon. I heard it from the wall. Behind us. The echo. They are tucked under the far ledge. where we cannot see them. Waiting. Rowan stared at her. She had not heard the sound. She had heard the reflection of the sound. She had used the entire canyon as an ear. He backed away from the right fork. He knew she was right. Cullum's posse, following the tracks, would ride straight into the kill zone. He looked at the left fork. The goat path. Up, he said. It was a hard, dangerous climb. They led the horses, the animals' iron shoes scraping and sliding. It took them an hour, but it brought them out onto a high, narrow ledge, looking down into the box canyon Tolder had chosen. Maris had been right. It was a perfect trap. Below them, nestled under a deep overhang, Jax Tolder and his 3 men were resting. They were comfortable, protected from the sun, their rifles laid across their laps. They were playing cards on a saddle blanket, waiting. The stolen cattle were penned at the far end of the box canyon, blocked by a simple rope line. "They'll wait all day," Rowan whispered. "Then move the herd at night. They are too comfortable," Maris said. "They are in the shade. They will not move until they have to." Rowan looked at the sky. He looked at the dry brush around him. He looked at the men and the dry overhang that protected them. He needed them out. He needed them exposed. He handed Maris the reins to all 3 horses. "Do not move, and do not make a sound." He slipped away, moving back down the trail. He returned 10 minutes later, his arms full of damp, half-rotted leaves and green scrub pine branches, pulled from a shaded seep he had passed. He built a small, careful fire, no bigger than his hat, tucked behind a rock where it could not be seen. He got the tinder to catch. Then, carefully, layer by layer, he piled the damp leaves and green pine onto the embers. It did not create a large flame. It created smoke, a thick, wet, greasy plume of gray-white smoke. It did not smell like a campfire. It smelled like a forest fire just starting. It smelled like the air just before a massive electrical storm, heavy with ozone and damp. The wind in the canyon, though slight, was steady. It caught the heavy smoke and, instead of lifting it, began to push it down the canyon wall. It sank like a shroud, rolling over the ledge and pouring into the box canyon below. Down in the camp. The first man smelled it. He looked up, his cards forgotten. "What's that fire?" Jax Tolder stood, sniffing the air. The smoke was thick now, acrid. "It smells wet," his partner said, confused. "Like rain." "It is a gully washer," Tolder snapped, his nerve breaking. He knew these canyons. A flash flood was more dangerous than a posse. "That's what that lightning smell is. We'll be drowned in this hole. Get out of the low ground, grab your rifles, move to the rocks." They did exactly as Rowan had predicted. They abandoned their protected overhang. They abandoned the cattle. They scrambled, coughing, up the opposite side of the canyon to a high, exposed pile of boulders, seeking safety from a flood that was not coming. They were now in the open, silhouetted against the rock. Rowan had his rifle ready. He was not on their level. He was above them, a ghost in the smoke. He did not aim at Tolder. He did not aim at any of the men. He took a steady bead on their supply wagon, which was loaded with their food, water, and ammunition, and he squeezed the trigger. The shot was impossibly loud, cracking and echoing a dozen times, sounding like an entire squad of riflemen. Down below, the front wheel of the wagon disintegrated into a spray of splintered wood. The wagon lurched and collapsed onto its axle. "We are found!" Tolder screamed, firing wildly into the smoke. At nothing. "It is the posse. They are above us." Rowan fired again. He did not aim at the wagon. He aimed at the rock face, 10 feet above Tolder's head. A shower of granite chips and dust rained down on the rustlers. It was not a shot to kill. It was a shot to speak. It said, "I see you. I can hit you. I am just choosing not to." That was enough. Jax Tolder was a thief, not a fool. He was exposed. His wagon was broken. He was being fired upon with pinpoint accuracy from an unseen enemy. And the law was, he assumed, riding up the canyon. "It is a trap scatter," he yelled. He and his 3 men did not even look back at the cattle. They bolted, scrambling up the far side of the rocky incline, disappearing over the ridge. They ran for their lives. Rowan watched them go. He did not fire again. He waited. After 5 long minutes of silence, he stood up. The smoke was clearing. In the canyon below, the 30 head of cattle milled nervously. The rustlers' camp was empty. Their broken wagon sat as a monument to their failure. Rowan and Maris made their way down. An hour later, as Rowan was inspecting the cattle, Sheriff Cullum and his 4-man posse rode into the box canyon. They rode in slowly, their guns drawn. Having found the ambush site empty, they stopped, staring at the scene. They saw the broken wagon. They saw the 30 head of cattle. And they saw Rowan Hale calmly tying a rope on a calf, with Maris Keene holding Hollow Finch's reins. Cullum's face was a mask of pure, astonished frustration. He looked at the empty canyon, at the high ledge. He looked at Rowan. "Hale," the sheriff said, his voice flat. "You found them." "Tolder and his men left," Rowan said, not looking up from his knot. "They seem to be in a hurry. They left their wagon." Cullum dismounted, his boots heavy in the dust. He walked over to Rowan. He looked at Maris, who stood by the horses, silent as a shadow. "You," Cullum said to Rowan, but his eyes were on her. "You listened for them." "We found a better path," Rowan said, cutting him off. "She found the path." Cullum spat. "Well, the county thanks you. Hale, you and your pathfinder. You saved us a week's ride in a bloody fight." He turned to his exhausted deputies. "Start the drive, boys. Let us get these animals home." As the men began to move the herd, Cullum stepped closer to Rowan. His voice was low, grudging. "This does not change a thing. You know that. This miracle will just make the talk worse. Pike will say you used witchcraft to catch Tolder. You are making yourself a target. Hale, you and her both." Rowan finished his knot and stood up, coiling his rope. "The cattle are going home. Sheriff, that is all that matters." When the drive reached the open rangelands, the owners of the Bar T and Circle K were waiting. They were not suspicious. They were weeping with gratitude. "Hale, we heard," the Circle K foreman said, his voice thick. "You saved our season. How can we repay you?" Rowan just nodded. "Just neighborly." The next day, 2 heavy wagons rolled up the track to Hollow Step. They were not from the sheriff. They were from the ranchers. They were loaded with bales of sweet hay, sacks of oats, and new 100-pound salt licks. It was a language Rowan understood. The Bar T foreman, a man named Eli, tipped his hat to Maris, who was watching from the porch. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of respect, "we will be speaking at the church meeting this Sunday. We are going to tell Reverend Pike and the whole town exactly what dark power it was that saved our herds. We are going to tell them it was courage and loyalty." The tide in the county had turned. The witch was now a hero. In Dry Lantern Ridge, Delia Crow heard the news. She heard how the ranchers, the backbone of the county, were now praising the girl. Delia was a businesswoman. She knew a losing hand. It was time to fold and to hedge her bet. A few days later, the weekly supply wagon stopped at Hollow Step. The driver, a young man who now looked at Maris with awe, handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. "This is for you, ma'am," he said. "From Mrs. Crow at the Silver Lamp." She said it's a gift for the community service. Rowan watched as Maris unwrapped it. Inside was a brand new, expensive storm lantern. Its brass was polished to a high shine, the glass chimney clear and perfect. Rowan looked at it, his expression grim. She is trying to buy her way back. She sees which way the wind is blowing, a gift with a knife in it. Maris examined the lantern. It was heavy, well made. She checked the wick. That evening, Rowan watched as she filled it with his best coal oil. She lit the wick, and a bright, steady, beautiful light flared to life. It was far brighter than his own old, dented lamps. She did not keep it on the kitchen table. She took it outside. She hung it from the main post of the porch roof, the post that faced the long, dark track leading from town. The golden light cut a wide, welcoming circle in the darkness. "Why there?" Rowan asked, stepping out onto the porch. "Everyone will see it." Maris looked at the warm, steady glow. Her face softened by it. "It is for anyone who is lost," she said, her voice quiet, "so they know where to come." Spring came to the high desert not as a gentle thaw, but as a sudden, desperate greening. The creeks ran high with snowmelt, and the young grass, as the old-timers called it, pushed up through the red mud, a faint, fragrant fuzz that promised life. With the new grass came a new weather soft, mizzling rains that would last for hours. Not the violent, roof-shattering deluges of the storm season, but a gentle, soaking precipitation that smelled of wet earth and clean stone. The hollow step ranch had changed. The barn was rebuilt, the north wall solid with fresh-cut pine. The new lantern from Delia Crow hung on the porch, its promise of safety fulfilled. But tonight, its light was unnecessary. The night was enclosed, private. Inside the main barn, a different lantern, Rowan's own dented, reliable work lantern, cast a soft, circular glow. The rain drummed a steady, quiet rhythm on the tin roof, a sound that was no longer a threat, but a comfort. It was the sound of a full cistern, of growing grass. Rowan and Maris were in the barn late. A new mare had foaled, and they were checking on the pair. The air was warm, thick with the sweet, dusty scent of dry hay and the loamy smell of the damp animals. The foal was asleep, and the mare was quietly eating. Their work was, for the moment, done. Rowan, however, was not ready to leave the warm, dry space. He had found a strange, quiet contentment in these shared, silent tasks. He picked up a bridle he had been mending. The leather was dark and supple from his oiling. "You know horses," he said, his voice quiet, fitting easily under the sound of the rain. "You know how they think, but you do not know the tack." She looked at him, her curiosity piqued. He held up the complex web of straps. "A bridle is not just for steering. It is a conversation, but you have to know the language." He moved to Hollow Finch, who stood dozing in his stall. The horse, now her devoted shadow, nickered softly as she approached. Rowan stood beside her, the bridle in his large hands, the lantern light catching the polished metal of the bit. "This," he said, touching the headstall, "needs to fit snug, no rubbing, but the bit, that is the real talk." He showed her how to hold it, how to offer it to the horse. "It has to rest light, right here." He guided her hand, showing her where to place her fingers on the horse's jaw. His hand, calloused and warm, covered hers. It was a simple, instructive gesture, but as his fingers brushed the slight, fine bones on the back of her hand, something changed. It was not a spark, it was a jolt, a sudden, silent surge of heat that was as real and as powerful as the lightning strike that had saved his herd. Rowan's hand stilled, his breath caught. Maris froze. She did not pull away. She simply stopped breathing, her hand trapped beneath his, her entire being focused on that single point of contact. The rain on the roof seemed to grow louder, filling the sudden, heavy silence. Slowly, she lifted her head. She turned, her face angled up to his in the dim, golden light. Her eyes, those clear, knowing eyes that saw hollow floors and dying storms, were fixed on his. She was not afraid. She was not confused. She was simply waiting. She was listening, not to the wind or the earth, but to him. Rowan Hale, a man of 34 years who had lived a life of profound and aching solitude, felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He was clumsy with words, clumsier still with feelings. He was terrified of breaking this strange, delicate, powerful thing that stood between them. He searched her face. He saw the trust she had given him. He saw the woman who had stood by him against the town, the woman who had saved his life. He could not force this. He could not even ask for it. Not really. He could only offer. His voice was a rough whisper, barely louder than the rain. "Maris, is this—" "All right." She did not speak. She held his gaze. She gave him the same answer she had given when he'd offered her shelter, the same answer she'd given when he'd asked her to ride to town. She nodded. A single, slow, deliberate movement. Yes. He let out the breath he had been holding. He let the bridle fall, forgotten, into the clean straw. He moved with a reverence that was almost painful. He did not grab her. He did not pull her. He lifted his hand, the one that had held hers, and placed it, open and warm, on her back, between her shoulder blades. He felt the slight, strong line of her spine through the thin wool of her dress. He did not kiss her. Not yet. He simply stood there, his hand on her back, letting her feel his intention. He was giving her every chance to turn away. She did not. She leaned into his touch, just a fraction of an inch, a silent acceptance. With that small signal, he gently, slowly, guided her. He nudged her, step by step, away from the stall and toward the deep, clean pile of hay they had stacked for the new foal. It was a soft, fragrant bed. She moved with him, her eyes never leaving his, until the back of her legs met the soft hay and she sat, sinking into it. He followed, kneeling before her, his body shielding her from the draft of the barn door. He reached up, his rough fingers tangling in her hair, which was soft and unbound. He cupped the back of her head, his touch firm but tender. The old wool cloak she wore, the one she had arrived in, was fastened at her throat. He touched the simple wooden toggle. He did not undo it. He just rested his fingers there. A question. She lifted her own hands and, with steady fingers, undid the fastening. The cloak parted and, as she leaned back, it slipped from her shoulders, pooling around her waist. The lantern light caught the pale skin of her throat and collarbone. The air in the barn was humid, warm, and a faint sheen of perspiration glistened on her skin. He saw the pulse beating, fast and steady, at the base of her throat. Their breathing began to find the same rhythm, matching the steady drumming of the rain on the roof. He lowered his head. He did not claim her mouth. He started a slow, gentle exploration, a map of discovery. He pressed his lips to her temple, where the skin was thin. He felt her sigh, a tremor that ran through her whole body. He kissed the curve of her cheekbone, then the corner of her eye. He moved to the sensitive skin just behind her ear, and finally, his mouth brushed hers. It was a soft, questioning touch. Her response was not passive. It was not a surrender. It was an answer. Maris Keene, the girl who had been traded like property, reached up. She responded actively. Her arms, thin but strong, circled his neck, her fingers lacing into his hair, pulling him closer. She met his kiss. It was not a kiss of fire and demand. It was a kiss of finding. It was slow and deep and breathtakingly gentle. It was the first honest kiss either of them had ever truly known. It was all the words they had never said, all the thanks, all the trust, all the fear, all the relief. He eased her back fully into the fragrant hay, following her down. His weight braced on his elbows so as not to crush her. They lay on their sides, facing each other, their bodies pressed close. He felt the curve of her shoulder, the rise of her chest as she breathed, the thrum of her heart against his. Her eyes were still open, watching him, her gaze filled with a profound and absolute trust. They lay like that for a long time, their kisses growing deeper, more confident, but no less tender. The world shrank to the small, golden circle of the lantern, the smell of hay, and the sound of the rain. He found a thick wool blanket, one he kept for new calves, folded on a nearby bale. It was clean. He shook it open and, with one arm, pulled it over both of them, cocooning them against the damp. It was an act of profound domesticity, an act of protection, of home. They lay tangled together, wrapped in the wool, their bodies speaking the language of respect, of nurturing, of listening. After a long, quiet time, when the kisses had softened to mere breaths against each other's skin, Rowan pulled back just enough to see her face. He needed to be sure. This was a man's world, and he knew what damage it could do. "You all right?" he whispered. his voice thick, a small, slow, genuine smile spread across her face. Reaching her eyes, making them glow in the lamplight, she said nothing. Instead, she lifted her hand, the one he had bandaged, now healed, and pressed it flat against his chest, directly over his heart. She felt the strong, steady, honest beat. She nodded. He closed his eyes, relief washing over him. He pulled her closer, his face buried in her hair, and just held her. They lay in the warm, fragrant dark, their quiet breaths joining the sound of the rain. They listened. They listened to the storm that was not a storm. They listened to the sound of the foal shifting in its sleep. They listened to the two heartbeats, finally in rhythm, beating as one. It was a promise, made without a single word. From now on, we hear each other. We will hear each other before the wind. In the corner, the lantern burned, its steady flame swaying gently. It cast their mingled shadow against the wall of the barn, a single, peaceful shape, unmoving, safe, and profoundly warm. The gratitude of the ranchers was a solid, warm thing, like a new blanket. It lasted for 2 weeks, but in a town like Dry Lantern Ridge, gratitude was a poor crop. It withered fast, and what grew in its place was the hardier, deeper-rooted weed of suspicion. The change began, as it always did, as a whisper. It started in the pews of Reverend Pike's church. Pike had listened to Eli, the Bar T foreman, give his stammering, heartfelt thanks to Maris. He had watched his congregation nod, their fear replaced by a simple, secular admiration. And Pike had felt his power, the power of fear and righteousness, curdle. He was losing them, not to God, but to a girl. So the sermon changed. The rumor. Once she hears the storm. Twisted. It is not her ears, but her eyes. Pike thundered from his pulpit, his gaunt face lit by the morning sun. It is not the wind she commands, but men. The new rumor was far more potent, far more familiar. Rowan Hale uses no dark magic. He is a good man, bewitched. She has seduced him. She uses her wiles to control him, and through him, she will control this valley. The story of the barn was retold, not as a miracle of hearing, but as a moment of calculated, feminine temptation. The night in the hay, which no one had seen but which all could now imagine, became the center of the story. The whispers turned from witch to whore. Reverend Pike, his influence restored, was agitated. She is a moral blight. She is a Jezebel who has blinded our strongest rancher. We must vote. The town must vote to cast her out, to purge this sin from our community. Sheriff Wade Cullum was a man who liked a quiet life. He had been pleased with the capture of Tolder's men. His deputies had rounded them up after Rowan's work and the return of the cattle. But now, his town was splitting down the middle. On one side were the powerful ranchers, the Bar T, the Circle K, and now, Mrs. Lane, who spoke of Maris as a savior. On the other was Reverend Pike, who held the souls of the town's merchants, miners, and wives in his hand. Cullum, fearing a divide that would be impossible to manage, made his choice. He sided with the loudest voice. He announced a town meeting to be held in the hall. To investigate, he said, his face impassive, the moral character of new residents and ensure the stability of Coppervale County. He had, in effect, allied himself with Pike. Delia Crow, owner of the Silver Lamp, had been playing a quiet hand. Her gift of the lantern had been a masterpiece of public relations. But she was a woman who despised losing. She had been humiliated by the hole in her floor, by Maris's quiet, unnerving power. Now, Pike had created the accusation. Delia decided she would provide the evidence. She needed to prove that Maris was not just immoral, but a fraud. Her tool was a man named Silas Grody, a failed prospector who owed her $300 in whiskey debts. Silas was a desperate, twitchy man, and he wore a very distinctive pair of boots. One heel was missing, and the left sole had a crude, star-shaped patch of leather sewn onto it. The plan was simple. Silas would go to the town meeting and claim that Maris, in her arrogance, had given him advice. He would say she heard a rich vein of silver in the hills. He would say he spent his last dollar digging, only to have the tunnel collapse. proving her a liar and a fraud. As proof, he would carry a length of bright blue piggin string, a specialty rope that Delia, and only Delia, imported from St. Louis. He would claim Maris had given it to him at the ranch. It was a perfect, self-contained lie. Maris, meanwhile, knew the moment the wind changed. The looks she got in town were no longer fearful. They were leering. They were filled with contempt. She had gone to the smithy to have a kettle hook mended. As she waited, she stood in the alleyway behind the silver lamp to be out of the wind. She was not listening to the earth. She was just waiting. And she saw the tracks. In the damp earth of the alley, a man had been pacing, back and forth, back and forth. The footprints were nervous, and they were unique. A missing right heel, a star-shaped patch on the left sole. She watched from the shadows as Silas Grote himself came out of the saloon's back door, talking to Delia. Delia pressed a small coin into his hand. Silas nodded, his eyes darting, and hurried away. Maris said nothing. She went back into the smithy. While the blacksmith worked, she found a patch of cool, gray ash on the forge floor. She picked up a stray horseshoe nail, and with a slow, precise hand, she scratched the pattern of the footprint into the ash. She folded the small drawing and put it in her pocket. The town hall was packed. It was hot, and it smelled of sweat and anger. Rowan and Maris sat in the front row. They were an island. Rowan's face was stone. Maris was, as ever, quiet, her hands folded in her lap. Reverend Pike spoke first. His voice was a whip, lashing the crowd. "We are here to decide the fate of a woman who has come among us under false pretenses. A woman who has used her influence to cloud the judgment of a good man." He pointed his trembling finger at Rowan. "He is trapped, friends, blinded by a siren's call, deaf to the word of God." A murmur of "Amen" and "That's right" rolled through the crowd. "But it is not just sin," Pike cried. "It is deceit. She claims a power she does not have. She is a fraud, and there is one among us who has been her victim. On cue." Silas Grote stood up, his face a mask of practiced misery. "It is me, Reverend. I'm the one." All eyes turned. Silas, his hat in his hands, walked to the front. I'm a simple man, a prospector. I heard the talk, that she could hear the earth. I believed it. I went to her. I begged her." He choked back a fake sob. She pointed to the hills. She said, "There, deep, the silver is singing. She told me to dig." He was a fine actor. "I spent my last coin on powder and timber. I dug for a week, and yesterday, it all came down. A collapse. I lost my mule, my tools, everything. It was a lie. There was no silver. She's a fraud. She ruined me." To seal his story, he reached into his pocket. She gave me this, a marker. She said to mark the spot. From her ranch." He threw the coil of bright, unmistakable blue piggin string onto the table. The crowd gasped. They all knew that rope. It came from the silver lamp. Delia Crow stood up, a look of perfect, practiced shock on her face. That is my rope. I sell that, Mr. Hale. Rowan, did you buy this for her to give to this poor man?" The accusation hung in the air. Not only was Maris a fraud, but Rowan was her accomplice. Rowan Hale stood up. The room went silent. He was not a man of speeches. He held a single, folded piece of paper in his hand. "I was not at the ranch on the day he claims," Rowan said, his voice flat, carrying to the back wall. "I was in Santa Fe, registering my brand. I was gone for 3 days. Here is the receipt, dated." He placed the paper on the table. A murmur of confusion. Silas's story was already cracking. Rowan continued. "And Maris does not use rope. She uses leather." He looked, not at Delia, but at Silas. "But that is not the main thing." He nodded to Maris. She stood. She did not look at Pike, or Delia, or Silas. She looked at the crowd. She said nothing. She unfolded the small piece of paper from her pocket, the one with the ash tracing. She held it up for everyone to see. Then, with one steady, unwavering finger, she pointed down at Silas Grote's feet. 100 pairs of eyes followed her finger. Silas was standing on the clean, wooden planks of the town hall, but his boots were still damp from the street. The unique pattern, the missing right heel, the star-shaped patch on the left was printed in wet mud for everyone to see. It was an identical match to the drawing in her hand. Silas looked down. He saw what they saw. He went the color of old chalk. I... The crowd erupted. It is a lie. He was paid. Look at his boots. She knew. All eyes swung to Delia Crow. She was trapped, cornered. Pike was staring at her, his face dark with betrayal. The ranchers were staring at her, their faces hard. "This is your doing, Crow!" Eli shouted. "You paid him. You set this whole thing up." Delia panicked. She looked around, her eyes wild, searching for an escape. No, it was not me. I was forced. I had to. He made me." Sheriff Cullum, his face grim, stepped forward. "Who made you? Delia, who?" Delia, in her desperation, played her last, fatal card. She did not point at Silas. She pointed at the dark, open doorway at the back of the hall. "Jax told her," she shrieked. "The rustler. He is back. He came to my saloon. He threatened me. He said if I did not discredit the girl who caught him, he would burn me to the ground. He's the one. He's here. He made me lie." It was a brilliant, desperate deflection. It named a greater evil. It made her a victim. And it was, in part, true. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was Jax Tolder. He was not there to threaten Delia. He had slipped into town under cover of the meeting, seeking revenge on Rowan Hale. He had been hiding, listening, waiting for his chance. And he had just heard his name used as a shield. His face, bearded and dark, was a mask of pure rage. "You lie!" he snarled. "The hall exploded. Women screamed. Men dove for cover." Tolder's hand flashed to his belt. He was not interested in Delia. He saw Rowan. He saw the girl. This was it. He pulled his pistol. "This ends now. Hale." Rowan did not draw. His only thought was of her. He moved, shoving Maris to the floor behind the speaker's podium, his own body a solid, living shield over hers. Boom! The gunshot was deafening. It was not from Tolder. Sheriff Wade Cullum, his face no longer lazy, stood with his pistol drawn, smoke curling from the barrel. He had fired into the ceiling. Plaster rained down. "Tolder!" Cullum roared, his voice the very sound of the law. "Drop it! Now!" His gun was leveled, not at the ceiling, but at the center of Jax Tolder's chest. Tolder froze. He looked at Cullum. He looked at Rowan, who was already on his feet, his hand on his own gun. He looked at the 30 angry ranchers and miners now rising, blocking the only exit. His moment was gone. Slowly, his face contorted with hatred. Jax Tolder let his pistol clatter to the floor. Cullum's deputies were on him in a second, pinning his arms. The chaos was over. The silence that fell was absolute, heavy. The entire town had just watched the truth unspool. They had seen Pike's fear, Delia's plot, Silas's lie, and Tolder's raw violence. And they saw Rowan Hale, who had not spoken a word of anger, shielding the woman he loved. The evil magic was gone. In its place was just a pathetic, human mess. Delia Crow, her face ashen, tried to slip out in the confusion. Eli, the Bar T foreman, stepped into her path. "Not so fast. Mrs. Crow, I believe the sheriff has some questions for you." 2. Her reputation was not just damaged, it was destroyed. Reverend Pike stood alone by his podium, his sermon on evil force, evil power forgotten. He had summoned a demon, and it had turned out to be a broke prospector and a desperate saloon keeper. His authority, his very voice, had vanished. That night, back at Hollow Step, the new lantern on the porch cut its bright, steady circle in the dark. The ranch was quiet. Rowan was oiling a piece of harness, the rhythmic motion of his hands steady and calm. Maris was at the slate board. He heard the faint, dry scritch of the chalk. He looked over. She was not looking at him. She was looking at her own words, her face softened by the lamplight, but unsmiling. She looked tired. She had not written of victory or of justice. She had written, "Fear makes people lie." The shame of the town meeting hung over Dry Lantern Ridge like a low-grade fever. Delia Crow's saloon was shuttered, the windows dark, a crudely painted closed sign nailed to the door. Reverend Pike had canceled Sunday services, his church doors remaining locked for the first time in memory. Jax Tolder and his crew were in the territorial jail, but their capture felt like a symptom, not a cure. The town was quiet, divided, and deeply, profoundly ashamed. They had been led by fear and pride, and it had nearly torn them apart. And then, the rain began. It was not the violent, stabbing rain of a thunderstorm. It was a cold, high-country deluge, a steady, relentless soaking that lasted for 2 days. It was not the kind of rain that brought life. It was the kind that brought saturation. The ground, already damp from the spring thaws, could not hold another drop. The Red Sillon Hills, a range of barren, rocky peaks to the east of town, were shedding water in sheets. The dry arroyos and washes, empty for 360 days of the year, were now running high, turning the red earth into a slick, heavy slurry. At Hollow Step, Rowan was reinforcing the new barn wall, caulking the seams against the persistent wet. Maris was inside, sorting dried herbs. The rain on the roof was a steady, deafening drum. Suddenly, she stopped. Her hands went still over the bunches of rosemary. The house was silent, save for the rain. "Rowan," she called. Her voice was not sharp. It was tight, filled with a new kind of dread. He stepped inside, dripping, wiping the rain from his face. "What is it?" "The ground." She was looking at the floor, as if she could see through it. "It is not the rain I hear." He went still. "What, then?" "It's vibrating. The stones. The hills. I think the hills are moving." Before he could process this, the sound reached them. It was not a sound. At first, it was a vibration in the jawbone, a low-frequency hum that made the tin cups on the shelf rattle. Then it grew, rising from a hum to a growl, from a growl to a ground-shaking, deafening roar. It was the sound of 1,000,000 tons of water, rock and mud breaking free. It was the sound of the entire Red Sillon Range letting go. It sounded, as the survivors would later say, like a herd of 1,000 mad bulls, stampeding through the canyons, tearing the world apart. "The arroyo," Rowan breathed, his face going pale. "The town." He was out the door in a second, running for the horses. In Dry Lantern Ridge, the sound hit them with the force of a physical blow. The town was built on a wide, sloping plain, split in half by the very arroyo that was now a conduit for the flood. On the south side was the business district, the saloon, the general store, the sheriff's office. On the north side, on slightly lower ground, were the newer, poorer houses, the livery, and the one-room church schoolhouse. The school, led by Reverend Pike, had let out early. The children were on their way home, when the first wall of water, a 30-foot-high beast of brown mud, uprooted trees, and shattered rock, burst from the canyon mouth. It did not just fill the arroyo. It became the arroyo, the town's only bridge. A sturdy wooden structure was struck by the debris. The sound of its main support snapping was like a cannon shot. The children, halfway across, screamed. Reverend Pike, who had been walking in a daze of his own guilt, saw what was happening. He had been a coward in the town hall. He would not be one now. He ran onto the bridge, his black coat flying, and grabbed the 2 children nearest to him, the baker's twin daughters, no more than 7 years old. "Run!" he screamed at the others. But there was nowhere to run. The main supports were gone. The bridge, now held only by its steel anchor ropes on the banks, sagged violently, a broken-backed creature, turning the middle of it into a terrifying island. The water, a churning, roaring mass, tore at both ends. Pike, his face a mask of white terror, clung to the railing with one hand and held the 2 screaming, identical girls with the other. They were trapped. The entire town was on the banks, screaming, helpless. The air was filled with the roar of the water and the shriek of the children. Sheriff Cullum was there, firing his pistol into the air, a useless, desperate signal. "Ropes!" he yelled, but the gap was too wide, the water too fast. The bridge groaned, pounded by entire trees, and began to break apart. Rowan and Maris thundered into town, their horses slipping on the slick mud. They took in the scene in one horrifying glance, the roaring torrent, the collapsing bridge, and the preacher, their accuser, clinging to two small children. The crowd saw Maris, and a new sound went up, not a murmur of suspicion, but a desperate wail. "Do something, you can hear it, do something!" Rowan was already off his horse, his lariat in his hand. But he knew it was too short. The bridge was going. The debris was piling up against the upstream side, the pressure building. It would snap its anchors and be swept away in seconds. Maris did not look at the crowd. She ran to the edge of the new, violent river. She ignored the spray, the screams. She dropped to her knees, slamming her hands, then her ear flat against the vibrating, soaking wet earth. Her eyes closed. She was shutting out the world to listen to its bones. Rowan stood over her, his hand on his axe, his body a shield against the panicked crowd. "What is it? Maris, talk to me." She looked up, her face drenched, her eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. "It's splitting, the main current. The bedrock underneath is turning it." She pointed, not at the bridge, in front of them, but 30 yards downstream. "It's hitting a rock shelf. A new channel is tearing open. It's going to hit the bridge from the side." Rowan looked. She was right. A secondary wave was peeling off, creating a whirlpool that was about to slam into the bridge's flank. "It will tear it apart," Sheriff Cullum yelled, having heard her. "It's over! No!" Maris screamed, her voice cutting through the roar. "It's fighting the anchor ropes. They're holding it fast. It's a tether. When the side current hits, that tension will tear it to pieces." "So what do we do?" Rowan shouted, grabbing her shoulder. "Do not let it fight," she yelled back. "Cut the rope, the north anchor, cut it! Rowan, let it swing!" Cullum stared at her as if she were insane. "Cut the rope. That's the only thing holding it. It's the only thing killing it," Maris cried, pointing. "If you cut it, the pressure will be released. It won't break. It will pivot. It will swing downstream, like a gate. Cut it now." Rowan did not hesitate. He did not look at Cullum. He looked at Maris. He trusted her. He trusted her hearing more than his own eyes. "Eli," he roared, seeing the Bar T foreman. He shoved the end of his lariat into the man's hand. "Tie this to the rail, and hold me, you hold me, or I die." Before Eli could even nod, Rowan was moving. He plunged into the churning, freezing water. The current seized him, but the rope held. He was waist-deep, then chest-deep, fighting the pull. Logs and debris slammed into his body, but he kept his eyes on the prize, the massive granite boulder on the bank, where the thick steel anchor rope was bolted. He hauled himself from the water, his axe in his hand. The rope was as thick as his arm, straining so hard it was humming, vibrating like a giant guitar string. He swung the axe. Thwack! The blade bit deep, but the rope was wet. "Rowan!" he heard Maris scream. He saw the side current, the new wave, churning toward the bridge. He had seconds. He swung again. Thwack! The bridge let out a sound of pure, metallic torture. He saw Pike look at him, the preacher's eyes wide with the understanding of what he was about to do. Rowan put all his weight, all his strength, into the final blow. Thwack! The rope exploded. The cut ends whipped back like striking snakes. The effect was instantaneous. The bridge, freed from its northern anchor, did not collapse. It lurched. With a groan of twisting metal, it did exactly what Maris had said. It pivoted, the entire structure, with Pike and the children still clinging to it, swung violently downstream. The crowd shrieked, thinking it was the end. It was not. The massive, 20-ton structure swung in a huge, terrible arc and, with the force of a battering ram, slammed into the muddy south bank. 30 yards downstream, it grounded itself, stuck fast, a broken wreck. But it was out of the main current. It was safe. Rowan was hauled back, Sputtering, half-drowned, his hands raw, he did not stop. He grabbed his lariat and ran down the bank to where the bridge now lay. Pike was in shock, his body shielding the twins. Rowan's first throw was true, the loop settling perfectly over the preacher's head. "The girls!" Pike screamed, his voice raw. "Take the children first." Rowan shook his head. "Put the loop on them, both of them tight." Pike's fumbling. Frozen hands worked the rope, looping it under the arms of the two small, sobbing girls. Now, Rowan, Eli, and 3 other men hauled. They dragged the 2 children through the sucking mud, away from the wreck, up onto the bank, where their weeping mother collapsed over them. Rowan recoiled his rope. His arm was aching, but his second throw was just as true. It landed at Pike's feet. The preacher, his black coat weighing him down like an anchor, tied the knot. He was pulled, stumbling, onto solid ground. The rain was still pouring down. The town stood in the mud, silent, stunned, watching. Reverend Abram Pike, the man of iron and brimstone, stood for a moment, his chest heaving. He looked at the saved children. He looked at Rowan, who was coiling his rope, and then his eyes found Maris, who was standing alone, shaking from the cold, her energy spent. Pike did the last thing anyone expected. He fell to his knees, in the mud, in the rain, in front of his entire congregation. The preacher broke. He lowered his head into his hands and he began to sob. It was not a quiet weeping. It was a deep, agonizing, tearing sound of a man's pride shattering completely. He gasped, trying to stand, stumbling. "I was wrong. Oh, God, I was wrong." He looked at the crowd, his face a ruin of tears and mud. "I spoke of sin, of a dark power. I was the one. My heart was dark. It was pride." He looked at Maris, his voice breaking. I called her a witch. I led you in hate, and she heard the voice of God in the earth, and she saved us. She saved our children." He took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. "Maris, Miss Keene, in the name of God, can you forgive me?" It was a total, public surrender, a baptism in mud. Sheriff Cullum, who had stood watching, his face grim, walked forward. He said nothing. He looked at Pike, on his knees. He looked at Rowan. Then he looked at Maris. He slowly, deliberately, removed his hat, letting the cold rain plaster his hair to his head. He held the hat over his heart, and he gave her a single, slow, profound nod. It was the only apology he knew how to give, and it was enough. Maris watched, her face pale, the world swaying. The adrenaline that had held her up, the energy she had drawn from the earth, was gone. She had nothing left. Her knees buckled. She did not hit the ground. Rowan was there, catching her as she fell. He did not try to stand her up. He scooped her up into his arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. He held her against his chest. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering. He pulled her close, his face pressing against her wet hair, ignoring the crowd, ignoring the rain. He pressed his forehead to hers, a desperate, silent contact. Their eyes met. They said everything, the fear, the trust, the victory. The crowd, which had been frozen, suddenly moved. It was Mrs. Elaine, the widow, who moved first. She ran forward, pulling the thick wool shawl from her own shoulders. She wrapped it, tight, around Maris. "Bring her to my house," she commanded. "Now, get her warm." Then others, the baker, the twins' father, pushed through, holding a lit storm lantern high, pushing the dark back. "This way, light give them light." The bar T foreman. Eli took off his own heavy coat and draped it over Rowan's shoulders, covering them both. Someone else ran up with a steaming tin of hot coffee. A circle formed. A circle of people, of blankets, of hot soup, of lanterns. They moved as one, enclosing Rowan, who was carrying Maris, shielding them from the rain and the dark. They moved through the muddy streets, a small, bright island of light and warmth, the heart of the community. Finally, brokenly, beating as one. Later, at Mrs. Ulane's small, warm house, Rowan sat by the fire, Maris asleep in a chair beside him, wrapped in a dozen dry blankets. The twins, in their nightgowns, came out, their eyes wide. They walked up to Rowan. He looked at the lantern they had brought, the bright, new one Delia Crow had given them. It was sitting on the table, its light steady. Rowan picked it up. He handed it to the older twin. "Put this at the schoolhouse, when it is rebuilt," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Hang it on the door." "Why?" the girl whispered. "It is for anyone who is lost," he said, "so they know where to find their way home." The flood was a baptism, and the town of Dry Lantern Ridge emerged from the mud cleansed and blinking. The rebuilding began with a different spirit. It was no longer a town of sharp, individual edges, but a community forced into a painful, shared shape. The sound of hammers on new wood rebuilding the bridge, patching the schoolhouse was constant, but it felt less like work and more like an act of collective penance. The epicenter of this new world was not the rebuilt church or the sheriff's office. It was, strangely, Hollow Step Ranch. The ranch itself had changed. It had become a destination. It started with Mrs. Ulane, who brought her boy not just for thanks, but for a lesson. He's afraid of the rain now," she'd confessed to Maris, her hands twisting in her apron. "He won't go outside. He just listens." And so, the listening corner was born. It was not a formal thing, just a simple wooden table Rowan built, placed on the porch under the overhang, near the new lantern's hook, on it. Maris placed items: the cracked slate board, a few sticks of chalk, bundles of dried herbs, chamomile, lavender, sage, and a few strange, smooth stones. After Mrs. Ulane, the baker's twins came, then 3 more children. Maris, they found, was not a teacher of words, but of senses. Rowan watched one afternoon as she sat with the 2 twins, the girls who had been on the bridge, a small dust devil, a harmless whirl of wind, kicked up in the yard. One of the girls flinched, her eyes wide with terror, grabbing for her sister. Maris did not comfort her with soft words. She placed one of the smooth, heavy stones in the girl's hand. "Hold this," she said, her voice quiet. "Feel the weight. It is not moving. The earth is still." She then took a small handful of dried chamomile flowers and crushed them in her palm, holding them under the girl's nose. "Breathe this. It is the smell of the ground. It is slow. The wind is fast. Fast is not always strong. Now, listen to the wind. It is high. It is thin. It is not the sound of the hills. It is just air. It is not danger. It is just noise." She was teaching them her language. She was giving them the tools to differentiate between fear, the panicked, chaotic noise in their own heads, the echo of Reverend Pike's sermons, and danger, the true, low vibration of a coming flood or a collapsing roof. She was giving them back the world by teaching them how to listen to it. Rowan, too, had become her student. He had spent his life fighting the land, forcing it to bend to his will. Now, he worked with it. He did not dig his new irrigation ditches where the land was lowest, but where Maris, her hand on the earth, said the ground was thirsty and the bedrock would hold the water. He raised his fences, not in straight, arbitrary lines, but following the contours of the land she identified, the places where the soil was thin and the rock was solid. His ranch, once a place of stubborn survival, was beginning to fit the land, to settle into it as if it belonged. He was learning, as she did, that strength did not come from resistance, but from listening. A week after the flood. Sheriff Wade Cullum rode out to the ranch. He was in his formal uniform, his badge polished, his hat brushed. He looked profoundly uncomfortable. He found Rowan and Maris on the porch, in the listening corner. He dismounted, holding a rolled piece of paper tied with a blue ribbon. He did not meet Rowan's eye. He addressed Maris. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat. "Miss Keene." He held out the scroll. This is a formal letter of thanks. From the county. For the bridge. For the children. Maris did not take it. She just looked at him. Cullum, flustered, unrolled it. It's all legal, signed by the county judge. It says, in recognition of conspicuous bravery and an unparalleled understanding of natural phenomena. He stumbled over the words. Embarrassed. It's a job offer. He finally blurted out, dropping the official pretense. The county, we want to hire you as a county advisor on weather and safety. Pay is, well, it's $20 a month to listen for us, to tell us when the next one is coming. He had just, in his own gruff way, offered the town, an official government salary. Maris was silent for a long moment. The sheriff shifted, his hat in his hands. Rowan watched, a small, unreadable smile playing on his lips. Maris looked at Rowan. She looked at his hands, which were resting on the new table he had built. He did not nod. He did not tell her what to do. He just met her gaze, his eyes full of a quiet, steady pride. He would stand by whatever she chose. She turned back to the sheriff. She did not smile, not fully, but the corners of her eyes softened. She gave a single, small nod. Cullum let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a minute. Good, that's good. You report to, you just report to me. When you hear something. He nodded, backing away, grateful to have the ordeal over. Good day. Hail, ma'am. He rode away, a man who had finally, successfully, fixed a problem he could not solve with a gun. The old order was fading. The supply wagon that week brought news Delia Crow had sold the silver lamp for pennies on the dollar to a buyer from Santa Fe. She had left town on the eastbound stage. In the middle of the night, the wagon driver handed Maris a letter. It was on cheap, lined paper, the handwriting a frantic, angry scrawl. It was from Delia. It was not so much an apology as a long, rambling list of excuses. It blamed Pike. It blamed Tolder. It blamed the town, the whiskey, the weather. But in the last, cramped line, there was a kernel of something real. I never should have lied about the rope. You were just a girl. I hope you get what you want. Maris read it, her face impassive. She folded it twice and used it to light the kindling in the kitchen stove. The following Sunday, Reverend Pike's church reopened. The whole town went, not out of faith, but out of a deep, nervous curiosity. The building was clean, the flood mud scrubbed from the floor. Pike stood at the pulpit. He was thinner, his eyes haunted, his black coat seeming too large for him. He did not open the Bible. I have spent my life, he began, his voice quiet. Not a thunderous boom, but a cracked whisper. Speaking, I have been shouting at you and at God. I thought the volume of my faith was its strength. He looked at the faces. The baker, Mrs. Elaine, Eli. I was wrong. I was terrified. I saw something I did not understand, and I called it evil. I was the one who was blind. I was the one who was deaf. His sermon was not from the scriptures. He called it listening with the heart. We were saved, he said, his voice gaining a small measure of its old strength, but new and clear. We were saved by a man who moved without hesitation. We were saved by a woman who did not listen to the noise of a panicked crowd, but to the truth of the earth. She heard the danger. I only heard the fear. He looked directly at the back pew, where Rowan and Maris had quietly slipped in. Maris Keene, he said, his voice breaking. She did not speak of God. She listened to his creation, and she taught us that faith is not a shout. It is a listening, a brave, quiet, listening. He bowed his head. I ask you all to forgive me, and to try to listen. That night, the ranch was still. The air was cool and clean. The world washed new. Rowan and Maris sat on the porch, in the 2 chairs they shared. The bright, new lantern was not lit. The moon was high and full, bathing the mesas in a sharp, silver light. Rowan, After a long, comfortable silence, did something Maris had never seen. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn, tin instrument, a harmonica. He looked at it, then at her, a little shy. He put it to his lips and played. It was a simple, halting tune, a cowboy melody, slow and a little sad. He was not a musician. The notes were reedy. And as he tried for a high part, the note came out as a sour, discordant squawk. He stopped, embarrassed, and lowered the instrument. Maris, her eyes closed, had been swaying slightly. She opened them. A tiny, genuine smile touched her lips. He smiled back. It was a moment of perfect, imperfect peace. He put the harmonica away. I have something, he said, his voice suddenly rough, awkward. He was more comfortable facing down rustlers. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of clean linen. I had the blacksmith in Santa Fe make it. He unwrapped it. It was a bracelet. It was not a delicate woman's thing. It was a solid, heavy cuff of pounded silver, made by a man who worked in iron, but it was beautiful. He fumbled. It's for what you did. She looked at it, her head tilted. Look inside, he said. She turned it over, scratched deep into the soft silver. The letters, crude but clear, were 3 words before the wind. I was thinking, he said, his voice very low. In the barn, that night, it felt like we heard each other, before any of it, before the storm, before the flood, before the wind. I felt I knew you, right then. Maris looked at the words for a long time. Her eyes were shining. She took the heavy silver cuff. Rowan held his breath, waiting for her to put it on. She did not. Instead, she took his left hand, his large, calloused, scarred hand. With a gentle, deliberate motion, she pressed the silver bracelet, engraving side down, against the inside of his thick wrist, holding it there for a heartbeat, as if marking him with the promise. Then, just as deliberately, she lifted it, turned, and fastened it securely onto her own wrist. The silver was bright against her skin. We wear it together, she whispered. They sat in the silver moonlight, his hand resting near hers on the table. The bracelet was a solid, cool weight on her arm. The house is small, Rowan said, looking at the door. It is strong, Maris replied, touching the wood of the table he had built. It needs a room, he said, a new idea forming. For when people come, for the children, for Mrs. Lane, for anyone, like Pike, who is afraid of the dark. She looked at him, and she knew exactly what he meant. A room, she agreed. By the kitchen, where the kettle is. We can put the lantern there. A tea and light room, he said, trying the words. A place for listening. She nodded and laid her hand, the one with the silver bracelet, over his. A place to sit, she said, for anyone who is lost, so they know where to come. The dust of Dry Lantern Ridge was no longer red with isolation. It was golden with light. The Harvest Festival was in full swing, a celebration of a season that had, against all odds, been saved. The air was crisp, smelling of roasted corn, apples, and the sweet, resinous scent of pine smoke, and everywhere there was light. Storm lanterns hung from every awning, every porch, every wagon. They were strung in lines across the main street, dozens of them, their wicks trimmed, their glass chimneys polished. It was a constellation brought down to earth, a defiant, joyful blaze against the vast, encroaching dark. The lantern Maris had hung on her porch had multiplied. The town, once afraid of the dark, had learned to make its own light. The centerpiece of the festival was not a rodeo or a drinking contest. It was a performance. On a low wooden stage, the children of the town, the baker's twins, Mrs. Lane's boy, and a half-dozen others were putting on a play. There were no words. It was a pantomime. Rowan and Maris stood at the back of the crowd, watching. They saw the baker's twins, playing themselves, get trapped on the stage, the bridge, while other children, flapping their arms, pretended to be the flood. A small boy wearing a black coat, a clear, affectionate caricature of Reverend Pike, ran onto the stage and held them, his face a mask of pretend terror. Then, a girl, the blacksmith's daughter, dressed in a simple calico dress with a gray shawl, ran to the edge of the stage. She knelt. She pressed her ear to the wooden planks. The entire crowd went silent, watching. The girl listened. She looked up, and with a sharp, clear gesture, she pointed to the side. Another small boy, dressed as Rowan with a toy axe, ran to a post and pretended to chop a rope. The preacher and the twins swung to safety, and the crowd burst into applause and laughter. The girl who played Maris did not bow. She just stood, looking at the crowd, her face calm, and then she pointed at the lanterns hanging above them, a gesture of safety. Reverend Pike, standing near Rowan, clapped the loudest, his face, no longer haunted, streaked with proud, happy tears. The play was not the end of the ceremony. Before the feast began, Sheriff Cullum, his voice now respectful, called for quiet. "And now," he announced, "Mr. Hale and Miss Keene will, well, they'll show us how to keep safe." Rowan and Maris stepped forward. This was the new tradition, the one that had replaced fear. It was the storm safety ritual. Rowan, his voice practical and steady, held up a length of new steel anchor rope. He spoke about pressure, about tension, about where to bolt the anchors for the new bridge so they held against a forward press, but could be released from the side. He showed them how to read the new watermarks, stone pylons he had set in the arroyo, carved with numbers 1 through 10 to show the water's height. Then Maris stepped forward. She held not a rope, but a simple stick. She walked to a patch of bare, packed earth. The town gathered close. "The earth speaks first," she said, her quiet voice carrying in the respectful silence. "A flood does not begin with water. It begins with sound. You will feel it in your feet." She tapped the ground. "This is a horse. Thump, thump, thump." She tapped it differently. A rapid, skittering beat. "This is fear, a stampede. It is noise. It is fast, but it is thin." Then she asked Rowan to drop a heavy blacksmith's hammer from his shoulder. He did. The thud that hit the ground was a single, low, heavy impact. "That," she said, as the crowd felt the vibration through their boots, "is the sound of the hills. That is the sound of danger. That is the sound you listen for. It is not noise. It is weight. When you feel that, you do not run. You climb." She was not a witch. She was not a savior. She was a teacher. She had taken the mystery that had terrified them and turned it into a practical, repeatable, life-saving lesson. She had given her knowledge to them, and in doing so, had made herself a part of them. After the lesson, the county judge, who had ridden in from Santa Fe, unveiled a new, thick, wooden plaque. It was to be hung on the rebuilt town hall. It read, "Community Sanctuary in the event of flood, fire, or storm. All are welcome at the Hollow Step Ranch." And beneath that, carved deep, were their names. Side by side, Rowan Hale, Maris Keene. The crowd cheered. A solid, full-throated roar of gratitude. Rowan stood beside Maris, his hand resting near hers. He was no longer the lone rancher. She was no longer the strange girl. They were an institution. They were home. Later, as the festival turned to dancing and feasting, Rowan and Maris slipped away. They did not go back to the ranch. They walked to the livery, to the quiet barn where they kept their supplies. The night was theirs, and the work was done. Inside, the barn was quiet, filled with the sweet, dry scent of the massive bales of straw and hay stored for the coming winter. The only light was the single storm lantern they had brought, the one from Delia Crow, its bright, steady glow casting their shadows long and peaceful. A light wind, cool with the promise of autumn, stirred through the open barn door. It whispered through the rafters, rustling the straw. Maris, who had been unbuckling a saddle, suddenly went still. She stopped, her head tilting, listening. Rowan felt a flicker of the old alarm. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. She turned. She smiled, a full, slow, radiant smile that lit her face. "Nothing," she whispered. "It's just the wind." She walked to him. He stood by the great stack of hay, a mountain of gold. She did not stop until she was standing directly in front of him. She lifted her hand, the one with the silver bracelet, before the wind, and placed it flat against his chest, over his heart. Then she laid her other hand, palm flat, on his back, between his shoulders. It was the same touch, the same spot as that first night in the barn, the night of the rain and the hay. But that first touch had been a question, tentative, breathless. This touch was an answer. It was a statement. It was solid, calm, and sure. It did not ask. It belonged. He covered the hand on his chest with his own, his rough fingers lacing through hers. "I am cold," she whispered. Though the night was not, he understood. He smiled and reached for the thick wool blanket he kept there for the horses. He shook it open, the same blanket from that first night, and wrapped it around her shoulders. He pulled her close, and then wrapped it around himself, cocooning them both, under the clean, dry, fragrant mountain of straw. They sank down, a single, warm shape in the golden light. He did not guide her. They moved as one. They lay on their sides, wrapped in the wool, facing each other. He looked at her, at this woman who had remade his world, who had saved his life, his ranch, and his soul. He kissed her. The kiss was not the desperate, finding kiss of that first night. It was a kiss of knowing. It was slow and deep and profoundly warm. They were not hiding from a storm. They were not hiding from the town. They were simply, finally, at peace. The lantern flame cast a steady, unwavering light on them, its reflection shimmering on the silver bracelet on her wrist. After a long time, he just held her. He gently, with a simple touch to her back, guided her head to rest on his shoulder, his chin resting on her hair. It smelled of hay and the clean, cool night air. They lay in the quiet, listening to the distant fiddle music from the festival, listening to the rustle of the wind. Maris let out a long, soft sigh, a sound of pure contentment, her body molding against his. "I hear it," she whispered. His arms tightened around her. "The wind." "No," she said, her voice muffled against his coat, her smile in her words. "I hear it now, the sound of home." Rowan Hale closed his eyes, his heart full to bursting. He held his wife, and he said nothing, for no words were needed. Outside the barn, two families, full from the feast, walked by on their way home. They saw the light from the lantern, and the single mingled shadow it cast on the barn wall. They saw the silhouette of two people, leaning against each other, unmoving. The shape was not one of passion, but of absolute, earned peace. The father put his arm around his wife, and the mother pulled her child's blanket tighter, and they walked on, leaving the quiet shadow to its rest. That night, at Hollow Step, the old cracked slate board hung by the door. The tea and light room was half built, its new pine walls smelling of the future. On the slate, in Maris's small, sharp, clear hand, there was a new message, a permanent one. "The day will be kind. We will hear each other before the wind." The words, and the people, and the ranch had finally settled, and the high prairie wind, the wind that had once brought only dust and loneliness, now swept over the mesas, and it whispered. It whispered the story to the rabbit brush and the stones. It told of a land of harshness, a land of fear, and of the two hearts who, in all that noise, had finally learned the language that has no sound, the language that requires only the courage to listen. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from and share your thoughts so we can all connect. We invite you to subscribe to the Wild West Stories 1850 channel, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.